everyone, my name is Nneka, and I am an urban designer who's really passionate about leveraging the power of design and technology to help people, especially people who are most vulnerable in society. So today I want to talk a little bit more about what it means to actually take a step back and maybe critique how our design processes are and try to find new ways to make our processes more inclusive and equitable, especially when working with vulnerable communities. So in the world with rising inequality, there are so many opportunities for designers like you and me to actually use design for good. For example, this is actually a project by Nicolas Negroponte, who started One Laptop Per Child. And One Laptop Per Child, pretty much the goal was to disrupt global education and make it more accessible for people all across the world, targeting poor communities, poor countries. So he quotes that the mission of One Laptop Per Child is to create educational opportunities for the world's poorest children by providing those laptops, which are low cost and durable. So Nicolas's work was backed by Google, my alma mater, MIT, UNICEF, and other really powerful organizations, and it had the intention of being able to do a lot of good. However, even if your intentions are good, it doesn't necessarily mean that your design is successful. One laptop per child represents how there is actually a difference between designing for communities and designing with communities. Unfortunately, One Laptop Per Child didn't actually take into account a lot of cultural and institutional differences in what it means to actually improve education quality in those respective countries. And there was also this assumption that, these countries, their education systems needed to be saved by this Western designer. And by assuming that something that has challenges needs to be saved by you is actually a very problematic notion. But what do we do? I am a designer, many of you are designers, and we have inherent privileges. We have resources, knowledge, we have the passion, and we really just want to help communities. However, we usually are kind of putting ourselves in the center of this change. And this kind of perpetuates this notion that it's usually through the designer that change can be done. But like Fernando mentioned earlier, we might need to shift the role of how we think about design. Instead of putting ourselves in the middle as a savior, why don't we actually listen and support rather than impose? What if there's a way that communities can actually have equal ways to access us, our resources and our knowledge, and teach us things? This kind of more equilateral process this can help communities actually be the teachers for us, and they're able to then develop their own narratives and approaches that enable community autonomy and ownership of their own future. Oh, it's a blurry. Sorry. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about a special project that I did working with a very special community in Accra, Ghana, and that was actually the inspiration to a new approach that I would like to share on how I think design research can be done more equitably. So let's actually travel to Accra, the capital of Ghana, but more specifically, the neighborhood of Nima. And to be very technical, it's actually located in the municipality of Ayawaso East, so you might see some of that in my captions. So Ayawaso East, Nima, is actually located smack dab in the middle of Accra, and it's home to 95,000 people. And it has a really unique history and a really cool character. It's a really bustling entrepreneurial community with a vibrant community activism spirit. Because Nima was actually informally settled by migrants from northern Ghana a few decades ago, the neighborhood actually has a few challenges, like economic exclusion and challenging urban design. So for example, sometimes it's actually difficult for services like ambulance to access people who live in the neighborhood because some of the streets like this can actually only fit just 2 people. And also, this has made it hard for government and private sectors to even provide services like waste management. So in addition to kind of the challenging physical conditions, there are also other political and economic perspectives that have also been the reason why the government and private institutions don't actually provide waste management to this specific community. So again, out of this really large neighborhood, there's actually only four public waste receptacles located in this whole neighborhood. Those are the yellow pluses on the periphery of the building. And sometimes residents actually have to walk up to 10 minutes to throw away their trash. And if they're not able to walk 10 minutes, usually what they do is they'll find a guy like this one who is an informal waste man, and they have to pay him to throw away their waste. And again, this is a really low income community, so sometimes it's actually not even feasible to afford to throw away your waste. Oh, that's really blurry, that's unfortunate. This system clearly isn't enough. Oftentimes, the waste that people have just gets thrown away in the streets or it clogs up local waterways. This actually is an image of the beach, the local waterway, where it's just full of plastic wattles. And I mean, the residents of NEMA love their home, and like anyone else, no one really wants trash right outside of their doorstep. So the community has decided to create creative but drastic ways to kind of solve for their waste problem. For example, this is actually a picture of burning waste right outside of the neighborhood, which again really solves for kind of some of those immediate needs of just getting rid of trash, but there's a lot of plastic that they're burning, and that's usually not very healthy in the long term. So like most socially conscious designers, I'm just dying to know, how can I help? But before I kind of jump into that, I need to take a step back and not try to save. So I really wanted to think of what is a new way that I can work with this community, and what are some new rules I might have to go by as a designer to be able to be sensitive to the power dynamic that I have as a Western designer working in this place that I've actually never even been in before. So before I kind of dive into the process, I want to start with some important principles, some ground rules that I defined. So the very first one is allyship. Just because you care about something and have good intentions doesn't actually mean you understand. So it's crucial to take a step back and not come in with your own ideas on how things should be done. This is actually just about listening and trying to reinforce what the community cares about and their vision for the future. Number two is appreciation for what is already working. Especially in states of crises, it's really easy to focus on what's going wrong. But don't get me wrong, it's important to know what's going on and kind of acknowledge failures in greater systems. But these communities are not blank slates, and it's important to kind of work with the existing assets that they already have. The next is co-creation. Like I'm saying, and many of us have said before during this conference, it's about designing with rather than designing for. So by designing with, this allows for the community to take ownership of their own ideas, projects, and have autonomy in their own future, which helps them avoid being kind of susceptible to these greater systems, like not being provided waste, or design flaws, like if another one laptop per child kind of comes into their neighborhood. And ultimately, when a community is in charge of their own future, they are the most resilient, even when the designer is no longer involved. And this is actually very, very important. So as a hybrid of user experience, participatory action research, and appreciative inquiry, these are processes from outside of the discipline, my anti-exploitative approach to design combines exploratory, generative, and evaluative research methods that foster trust, value, build on local knowledge and problem solving, and enable authentic, choice-based, and dialogic engagement. Using my favorite quote by designer Dana Abdullah, this approach reframes the project to one that is mutual. It acknowledged users as active participants and partners rather than passive repositories of lore to be mined. In this diagram, there are 6 phases which are outlined in the yellow, and then the white are actually tools that are relevant to each particular phase, but obviously there are way more tools in our toolkit that we could possibly use. But this is what I actually used for my project. So now let's actually dive into the process. So the very first stage is dawn. And this is really important because I didn't actually start off by researching how can I actually fix this problem. I started off by researching who should I actually talk to. So through doing desk research, I did a lot of preliminary, was able to get a preliminary sense of some of the local leaders that I should connect with. And most literally what it started off is actually shifting through major reports by big institutions that may have done work in this area, and then just trying to kind of daisy chain my way to Facebook pages, Instagram pages, WhatsApp contacts to actually find people who live in this community and see if they would be interested in telling me more about their community and maybe working with them. So as a designer coming from MIT, who at this point has never been to Ghana in my entire life, I'm sure I raised a lot of red flags, like who's this person? But by reaching out to local partners ahead of time, and also when I got there, I decided to actually live in Nima and not stay in a nice hotel across town. I was able to really build that trust by being another member of the community during my multi-week field trip, or field visit. So once I gained the trust of the community, the locals really started opening up, and this is when the cool part really starts to happen. So I went to Ghana only having one WhatsApp connection to this person, Shaban. And Shaban is really amazing. He actually is the founder of this community organization that's focused on youth empowerment, and he's born and raised in Nima and is just really dedicated to this community. So, and I found him through, again, a report of someone who worked with him several years before I got there. And what was really interesting is, Shaban's organization just only had a Facebook page. And I think that it kind of made me expand how I actually think about what it means to have like legitimate organizations and presence. Like usually when you try to find an organization to work with, you try to find some fancy .org, .gov website, but it was really just through Facebook that I was able to find, again, his really amazing work. So I met with Shaban when I got to Ghana, and we had multiple talks on what my intentions were, and I really was trying my best to be transparent and also held accountable. What does he want to see from me to make sure that I am not going to disappoint him and that I am going to keep his trust, because he's about to open up his network to me, and I don't want to corrupt that or exploit that in any way. So once he said, okay, you seem like a cool person, he introduced me to Abu, who I'm going to talk about a lot in the next few slides. But Abu is a community organizer who's doing a lot of stuff around waste management. And he got excited about me wanting to work with him, so he introduced me to his friends. And then they introduced me to other residents and leaders in the neighborhood, which is really cool. So ultimately, at this stage, this really shows the power of trust and social network. It was also through just talking to the residents through that initial phase that I was able to understand that waste was something that they really cared about and they wanted to talk about it. So that's kind of where I knew that maybe that's the kind of project I might want to be able to help them with. So now this next phase is one of my favorite phases, because this is when you get to get your hands dirty and really explore and uncover the community's stories through different mediums of data. So from a more ethnographic perspective, I did interviews and contextual inquiry. And since I actually lived in the neighborhood and while I was conducting my field visits, it was really easy to just always be available to the community. If they were free, I was going to meet up with them and I was going to hang out with a day to see what the challenges were, what their lives were like, and what they actually did. And what was great about that is whatever their problems were my problems, or whatever their hopes were my hopes. So it was great just to be really embedded in the neighborhood that way. Yes, and then during this time too, I also spent a lot of time with Abu, who I mentioned a few slides back. And my time with Abu revealed that he's actually one of the main organizers who's working on trying to organize people in his residence to volunteer to pick up litter. which is really exciting. And he's going to tell me more about his work in the next few slides. Another way that I kind of did at the discovery phase was that I tried to tap into existing quantitative data and allowed and introduced the community to new participatory and transparent ways to collect data in their neighborhood. For example, this is actually a tool called Mapillary. It's free for anyone to use online, and you could just download an app, and what you do is you just upload photos, you take photos, and they're geotagged and stitched together to make maps. So this was actually great because I just spent multiple days hanging out with residents, and we would all just go around the whole neighborhood taking pictures, and it's now uploaded and a resource that's still used today. Like, if you look at the bottom right of this PowerPoint, you could see that this was uploaded in October 2019, which is a year and a half after I introduced this tool. So it's great that these are now tools the community can use because they're free and they don't need me to conduct this kind of information or get that data. So by collecting and layering community knowledge and more quantitative forms of data, I was able to map out the existing system of waste in NEMA. So systems mapping is a really essential tool that I use because it makes a case, it really kind of starts to reveal causes, consequences, and opportunities for design and trends that I am now seeing on why there was so much litter based on the actions of these different stakeholders. What's also powerful about this tool is it really builds empathy and contextualizes why the state of waste is the way it is. So, by showing you the photos before, it's really easy to think that maybe the residents of NEMA don't know about recycling, or maybe, they don't necessarily care to clean up their waste in their neighborhood. And unfortunately, I actually heard other residents of Ghana, not from this neighborhood, say those things. But actually, when you take a step back and look at the greater system of things, you realize, no, the reason why there's so much waste is not because of a failure of the residents. It's actually because the system was designed to set them up for failure, and that's really unfortunate. So it helps you actually know what you're designing for and how your design or your projects kind of play into a greater system that might need to actually be examined. So by understanding the parameters of the current waste system, this is actually why it's productive to start focusing on what is working in the local system and the local waste system. So it was great through just, again, the previous phases that I learned that Abu's actually just trying to get volunteers in his neighborhood to pick up waste. Every week, they actually just go around to residents and try to get trash bags from people, and then him and a team of people just pick up litter until they get tired and hungry. And this is great. Residents are really excited. They started donating money towards the cause, but Abu still has a few problems. He says that, people actually have lives, they have families, and although everyone really wants to contribute to this, it's hard to kind of volunteer for something when you already have so much to do during the day. So he would actually really like to find a new way to kind of turn this volunteer service into a more viable, full employment opportunity. However, again, since it's a low-income community and he's just one person, he can't pay everyone to now pick up waste full-time. So he was actually trying to think of maybe using other ways like bartering, which is something that the residents already do, to try to scale and make his waste management system more reliable. So based on what I heard from Abu, I decided that it's actually that very question that's going to be my project. So I decided to work with Abu to kind of define a specific quote and responsibilities for my work during the duration of my time in Ghana, which was a total of 6 weeks. So in the design phase, this is where I worked as a co-creator rather than a design savior. I worked closely with Abu's group, which is called Process Sanitation Team, to understand what resources they would like to kind of help them augment their initiatives. So this is when we decided that maybe a waste logistics manual that kind of helps visualize their plan, like how much waste is generated in the neighborhood, where should the drop-offs be, kind of based on these parameters. He thought that that would be really helpful for me to contribute to. So we created this manual that actually does just that. It is a more technical representation of kind of some ways that waste management can be scaled in NEMA. And this is a manual that includes formal instructions also on how Abu already kind of takes some of these plastic bottles and turns them into these larger waste receptacles that kind of serve as the public waste bins for the neighborhood now. So it's really great that he was just doing that in his bedroom, and now he actually has it in a book to kind of have instructions for other people in the neighborhood to be able to kind of make more waste bins. So in addition to the manual, I didn't really address how the team can actually pay people to pick up waste in the neighborhood. So that's when I actually worked with another team from my school to develop a project management tool that kind of helps community organizers like Abu formalize and compensate people to pick up litter through a barter-based transaction. So pretty much what this is, Abu can say, employ someone to work 40 hours for him, and then pay them in like a voucher to a local grocery store. And all of that is kind of automated to the through the app. So through my previous design phases, it was very clear that the community lacks financial resources, so they often barter in their everyday. Residents also use smartphones all the time, so by incorporating their natural way of doing things, it was very intuitive for Abu and his team to use an app that helps pay an employee a voucher to a local grocery store after they picked up waste for certain numbers of hours per week. So since I knew I couldn't be in NEMA forever, it's now important to start devolving my role and pass the torch to local leaders. So I met with Abu, Shaban, and other residents I was working with throughout the several weeks I was in NEMA, and co-developed ways to continue to implement our work. So for example, Abu and his team would share insights and plans through the manual that I actually helped create, which is at the bottom. So they would actually share with local residents like their strategy for picking up waste based on what was documented in the manual. And then also I knew Shaban, the very first person I met, runs a youth empowerment program, and he actually was doing a lot of work in designing curriculums to kind of help youth in the area build skills so they can become more valuable in the job market. So that's when I introduced another free tool, which some of you may have heard of, called Code Academy, which is actually Shaban then created a curriculum to teach local kids how to code, because this could be valuable in actually maintaining the app. And now they build skills and have experience to be able to maybe explore coding as an opportunity for employment in the future. And finally, this is the determine phase, the evaluation phase. And this is the most ongoing phase because it requires the ability to actually evaluate the impact of your project. So I left NEMA in spring of 2018, and I've been in regular touch with Abu and Shaban, more as a friend rather than, a colleague. But it's been great to kind of reflect on how the work that we did together has progressed, even though I'm no longer in Ghana. And this is actually kind of what I've learned. So based on principles of equitable design, we developed metrics to see if it was successful in creating space for allyship, autonomy, co-creation, and so on, which has been very valuable to assess. But the most significant measure of impact is to actually see how the project has evolved once the formal designer, myself, actually left the room. As of last week, I actually learned that Abu really has scaled his organization, or his operation, and now teaches schools and residents on how to make his signature waste bins. And also, it's really great in this photo too, because in the bottom right, you see Abu now has a logo. He now has branding for what he's doing and can put his stamp on things. I also learned that Abu has been getting a lot of attention for his work. Currently, he's actually working with a group of students from the Netherlands. And one thing I love about this picture is that he's really in control. He's in the center kind of telling these students what he wants and what his ideas are. And they're being really attentive. And I think that's great because I'm glad that it's this situation and not the other way around, where these students are kind of telling Abu what they want him to do. I've also learned that Abu has really been recognized for his work, which is really exciting. He's been awarded on so many levels, locally and regionally, for all of his work in teaching and actually really mobilizing around trying to create this alternative grassroots waste management system in NEMA, which has been that has been successful in really trying to reduce the amount of litter in the neighborhood. I mean, not all of the litter is gone. That's going to take years, and it's going to take that systems level of change. But it's just really great to know that it was just through the process of working together and sharing tools and sharing ideas that Abu and Shaban are continuing this work, and they're really making progress on making an impact, very physical and explicit impact in NEMA. So on reflecting on my project, I've had a few takeaways. I realized that process over product is where the value really lies. For example, over time, the team and I worked to kind of build the app, and then we realized that scaling the app actually may not be that feasible. And although the app necessarily wasn't the next biggest, greatest thing, I wouldn't say that the project actually failed. I mean, the fact that that waste management, an alternative waste management system is still a project, an ongoing project in NEMA, shows that there's actually something really there, like a legacy around that. And I really think it's just the process of working together, again, and the tools that we shared that is what made this successful. Another really important thing is to design contextually. I think it was important, one, to not come in with these assumptions like, oh, you know, in the United States, this is how we kind of collect waste, and maybe that would work here, and try to find ways to kind of appropriate a US waste management system to Ghana. It was just way more complex than that on a social, political, economic level. So it is really important to kind of, again, see how things are done and figure out what's already working and kind of just adding on to that. And then this is also something that's really important, using your privilege to actually kind of connect disparate resources. And when I say resources, I mean people, tools, knowledge. And usually when I talk to socially conscious designers and say privilege, everyone gets like a little nervous and feeling guilty, like, you know, I don't mean to impose, I can't help it. And I understand, but what was something that was really useful is I knew I had privilege and I knew I had good intentions, and I was actually able to use that privilege for good. I didn't mention this earlier, but during my dawn phase, I actually met with government officials, like ministers in the country. And these are people who the residents of NEMA have been trying to get a hold of for years and never gave them any attention. But I was able to send an email and get a visit, and I pretty much was able to bridge that connection. I said, I am working with this community. I know what you're doing. Maybe you two should be more in touch. And actually now, especially that Abu's winning a lot of awards at various levels of government, I think that the government is listening. So there are actually ways you can use your privilege to kind of help augment the voices for the people that you're really trying to empower. So that is all that I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. That was a really great presentation. It's great to see your process and to hear you articulate it, and then the happy situation of having some impact as well. We heard previously about hybridity in a cultural sense, but I guess I'm thinking about you as a researcher or a creative practitioner. I'm thinking, well, there's definitely hybridity here, and I'm wondering how you self-identify, because I heard various titles. I'm an urbanist, I'm a formal designer, an ethnographer, a visitor of sorts. I just wondered if there's particular roles that you feel are stronger, have weakened, that you're holding on to. How do you self-identify?
Yeah, that's a super personal question. It's something I think about all the time because pretty much I have a lot of slashes in my resume, like I'm this, slash this, slash this. But I actually got my start off in urban planning and policy, and then expanded to urban design, and now I do civic technology. So that's actually now why I call myself a designer, because I think I know I'm always going to kind of work at various disciplines and various scales, and I don't want to be limited only to policy or only to urbanism, but it is kind of the thread in all of my work. So the short answer, I'm a designer, design activist, but I am very aware that formally I do touch a lot of disciplines, which is something that I think is really exciting, and I don't want to limit myself to kind of having to pick just one.
Hi. Thank you for your passions. I got two questions. The first one is historically how you related your work to community architecture in the UK or participatory design in the Scandinavian context. How it differs from now it's like 40 years now. What is different between yours and their work? Second question is, what is your real agenda? Is it a PhD? Is it why you coming from MIT going to Ghana? Can you share a bit more? Because I think that is a very important agency questions, like because you start with a critics of this sort of like quite top-down like laptop project, but your project doesn't seem to me too far away from that if you doesn't explain it properly.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I didn't make it clear, but this is actually my thesis research. So I was studying my thesis in urban design at MIT and knew that I was really interested in trying to explore a relationship between designers and marginalized communities. And because I am Caribbean American, I was really interested in working with more African or global South communities. And then the very first question, I actually, to be honest, am not too familiar with what Scandinavian and UK co-design looks like because I'm actually based out of New York City and have lived my whole life in the US. But I do know something that I've been very aware of, especially in a US context, is that usually designers oftentimes work with communities where people do not come from a similar context from them at all. And that, I think, is kind of a universal concept I was trying to explore in my work. So as a designer, sometimes you might be working with prison populations. I've never been to prison. How can I actually have empathy and think of equity in my work when working with someone that may not actually be aware of my discipline and may not come from a similar background as me? So I think, again, that's kind of a universal theme I was trying to explore.
Maybe that's my question is, would that be a new practice that you actually putting yourself into the situation? Yeah, you can't design for people in prison, but how can you putting yourself as a designer become a prisoner in thinking in that way? I think this is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, it's a universal practice that designer design for someone, but we're talking about with, but I think it's even more the new practice is about by them. So we're not actually design particularly with this group of people, but actually empowering them as we are actually part of it. So like how the global citizenship relationship with this concept. So that's what I'm trying to say. What you trying to suggest may not explain properly that how you're different between with the laptop design.
Yeah, I think that's really what the dawn phase was about. Again, embedding myself in that context and understanding, again, like what their problems were are now my problems. So it's not necessarily a role play because it's deeper than that. It's actually really trying to take on the mindset of the people I'm working with to become almost part of them in that sense. So yeah, that's a good point.
I was curious to know why you thought the mobile app didn't work, because you mentioned you didn't think it was successful. So I was curious to know why, because that's an interesting analysis in itself.
Yeah, and I was actually cautious in not really trying to talk a lot about the products, because again, it was the process that I was really focused on. So it was actually a logistics problem. So creating the app, again, I worked with a team of technologists back in the United States, and just trying to run this as a full-time project just was not feasible logistically. So that's actually why the app didn't work. It actually didn't really have much to do about the community not wanting to use the app. Yeah, it really needed a person to run it and more funding. So that was kind of, yeah, again, it was a logistics question. Yeah, good question. Really broad. I think that it's important to, I think it's easy when you feel a little guilty about, wanting, like feeling that tension between wanting to do good but feeling a little guilty about privilege. It's kind of easy to kind of gloss over and say, well, at the end we had a really amazing project and everyone liked it. So I think, again, focusing on process and not the end product is a really important point of reflection, and trying to kind of navigate these tensions between like, well, did you actually make an impact, or are you just trying to make yourself feel a little bit better? So I think that's really important. And again, I think it's also important to not talk over communities you're working with. Like, it really takes a type of restraint to be able to take a step back and not kind of even come in with any sort of idea of how you want to design something. So I was actually kind of arguing before the design process even starts or the ideation process even starts, it's actually just the talking process. So that is something that's very important that should be considered more in design projects, I think.
We've got time just for one more, and I think you've got the microphone.
I suppose the question to ask is, do you feel like part of your contribution in this project and with the local community is a kind of an introduction to design as education? Because there are people who are interested and very capable, but possibly don't have the same educational opportunities. So what you're doing is enabling through the skills and knowledge that you have. So rather than this being a designed intervention, it's an introduction to a design education.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really exciting to kind of hear a lot of the other speakers get at this notion as well. And I think, yes. And I thought, I never really saw myself as a teacher or before this project, but what was really helpful is the introduction of tools. Because, you know, we are experts in a sense, like there are curriculums based on design research. And I didn't necessarily introduce the community to a curriculum, but it was really through actually like saying, well, here's a tool, these are ways you can use this tool, and try to find ways that these tools can be augmented, expanded, and adapted to their context was something that there's something inherent to teaching that was in that also relates to the way that we actually teach design curriculums.
I think there's about 2 or 3 other people that wanted to ask questions, so I'm going to suggest that you catch up with Nneka over the next coffee break.
Great.
So you won't get much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.